A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. Solitude's Price. Maeve's hands were stained green from crushing nettle leaves when the first snowflake landed on her wooden workbench. She paused, watching it melt against the warm wood, leaving behind a tiny wet mark that would dry within moments. Winter was coming early this year. She could feel it in her bones, in the way the forest had gone quiet over the past week, in how the deer had already moved to lower ground. She returned to her work, grinding the nettle with practiced movements in her stone mortar. The paste would help old Greta in the village with her joint pain. Not that Greta ever thanked her properly, but Maeve had stopped expecting gratitude 2 years ago. She'd stopped expecting much of anything, really. Her cabin sat on the border between the Silver Creek territory and the unclaimed wilderness beyond. It was a simple structure of stone and timber, built by her mother's hands before illness had taken her 3 years past. The single room held everything Maeve owned. A narrow bed pushed against the far wall, the workbench where she prepared her medicines, shelves lined with clay jars, and dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, and a stone fireplace that provided the only heat when winter storms howled outside. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and no one could take it from her. Maeve transferred the nettle paste into a small clay pot, sealed it with wax, and set it aside. Her fingers moved to her left shoulder without conscious thought, tracing the area through the fabric of her worn brown dress. The phantom ache was always there, a reminder of the worst day of her life. 2 years. 2 years since Osric had stood before the entire Silver Creek pack and declared her unworthy. 2 years since he'd spoken the words that still echoed in her nightmares. "Your scent is too weak. You bring shame to the position of Luna. I, Osric of Silver Creek, reject you as my mate." The laughter had been worse than his words. Pack members she'd known since childhood had laughed as she'd stumbled away from the ceremonial circle, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Someone had spat at her feet. She couldn't remember who. The faces had blurred together in her memory, transformed into a mass of cruel smiles and mocking eyes. Her mother had died the year before, taken by a lung sickness that no amount of healing herbs could cure. Maeve had watched her waste away over months, helpless despite all her knowledge of plants and remedies. When her mother finally slipped away, Maeve had been left with nothing but the cabin, her mother's books on healing, and memories of gentler times. So when Osric rejected her, she had nowhere to go, no family to return to, no one who would stand beside her against the pack's judgment. She'd left that very night, walking through darkness until she reached this cabin at the territory's edge. The structure had stood empty since her mother's death, slowly falling into disrepair. Maeve had spent weeks making it livable again, patching the roof, clearing out the debris, and slowly rebuilding a life from the wreckage of her old one. The isolation had been difficult at first. Long days passed with no one to talk to except the birds and the occasional deer that wandered too close. But gradually, Maeve had adapted. She learned which berries were safest to eat, which streams ran clear year-round, and which parts of the forest to avoid when rogue wolves passed through. She made her living selling remedies in the small villages that dotted the region. Most people didn't know she was a shifter, didn't know about her Omega status or her rejection. To them, she was simply the strange woman who lived in the woods and made medicines that actually worked. It was a lonely existence, but loneliness was safer than risking her heart again. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Visitors were rare. Most villagers left payment for their medicines on her doorstep and departed quickly, uncomfortable with entering a shifter's home, even if they didn't fully understand what she was. Maeve crossed the small space and opened the heavy wooden door. A thin girl of perhaps 12 stood outside, shivering in a dress too light for the dropping temperature. "Please," the girl said, her voice trembling. "My brother. He's sick, burning with fever. Mother sent me to beg for help." Maeve's healer instincts kicked in immediately. "How long has he had the fever?" 3 days. "It keeps getting worse." 3 days. That was serious, especially for a child. Maeve grabbed her leather satchel from its hook by the door and began filling it with supplies. Willow bark for the fever, elderflower for sweating out the illness, honey to soothe any throat inflammation. "What's your name?" she asked as she worked. "Bess." "Well, Bess, we'll do everything we can for your brother. Lead the way." The girls' village was an hour's walk through increasingly heavy snow. By the time they arrived, Maeve's thin cloak was soaked through, and her teeth were chattering. The child's home was a small cottage with a thatched roof, smoke rising from a central chimney. Inside, a woman who looked worn beyond her years sat beside a cot, where a boy of perhaps 8 lay sweating and shaking. The mother's eyes widened when she saw Maeve. "You came?" she breathed. "I wasn't sure you would." "A child is sick," Maeve replied simply, kneeling beside the cot. "That's all that matters." She examined the boy quickly. High fever, rapid pulse, signs of infection in his lungs. Serious, but treatable if she acted fast. She prepared a tea from the willow bark and elderflower, adding honey to make it palatable, and gently lifted the boy's head to help him drink. "He needs to sweat out the fever," she explained to the mother. "Keep him warm, but not too warm. Give him this tea every few hours. I'll leave you enough for 3 days. If the fever doesn't break by then, send for me again." As she worked, Maeve felt the familiar pull of her healing gift. It would be so easy to simply place her hands on the boy's chest and draw out the infection directly. Her mother had possessed the same gift, though she'd warned Maeve repeatedly about its cost. "Every healing takes something from you," her mother had said during Maeve's training. "A piece of your own life force. Use it sparingly, only when there's no other choice." So Maeve relied on herbs and knowledge, saving her gift for true emergencies. The boy would recover with proper care. He didn't need her to sacrifice her own strength for him. She stayed until the boy drank the entire cup of tea, then showed the mother how to prepare more. The woman pressed 2 copper coins into Maeve's palm, apologizing that it wasn't more. "This is fine," Maeve assured her. "Just follow my instructions and he'll be well soon." The walk back to her cabin seemed longer in the dark. Snow fell steadily now, covering the forest floor in a blanket of white. Maeve pulled her damp cloak tighter and hurried her pace. She knew these woods well, but winter made everything more dangerous. Ice could hide treacherous footing, and wolves, both shifter and natural, grew desperate when food became scarce. She was perhaps halfway home when she heard the first howl. It came from the south, distant but clear in the cold air. Her steps faltered. That wasn't a natural wolf. The tone was wrong, carrying an intelligence and fury that spoke of shifter origin. Another howl answered, this one closer, then another, and another. Maeve broke into a run. Shifters fighting in these woods meant danger for anyone caught between them, and she was too far from her cabin to reach it safely. She veered off the main path, heading for a cluster of rocks she'd discovered months ago. It wasn't much shelter, but it was better than being caught in the open. The sounds of fighting grew louder behind her. Snarls and yelps of pain echoed through the trees. Maeve pressed herself against the cold stone, trying to make herself as small as possible. Then she saw them. Massive shapes moving between the trees, locked in brutal combat. Even in the darkness and falling snow, she could tell these were large wolves. Alphas, probably, given their size and the raw power she could sense even from this distance. One wolf in particular drew her eye. Pure white, larger than all the others, moving with deadly grace despite being surrounded. He fought against at least 10 opponents, maybe more. As Maeve watched in frozen horror, the white wolf took down 3 attackers in rapid succession, his jaws finding throats with terrible precision. But there were too many. Even as he fought, more wounds appeared on his magnificent coat. Blood stained the snow beneath his paws. He was tiring, his movements growing slower. Maeve knew she should stay hidden. This wasn't her fight. Getting involved in pack politics had only ever brought her pain, but she'd never been able to watch another creature suffer without trying to help. It was her greatest weakness, and perhaps her only true virtue. The white wolf went down, disappearing beneath a pile of attackers. Maeve heard a sound that chilled her blood, a wolf's scream of agony. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the attacking wolves scattered. They melted back into the forest, leaving their victim bleeding in the snow. Maeve waited, counting her heartbeats. When she was certain the attackers were truly gone, she emerged from her hiding spot and approached the fallen wolf cautiously. He was still alive, but barely. Massive wounds covered his body, and the snow around him was stained dark with blood. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and labored. Maeve knelt beside him, her healer's assessment happening automatically. multiple deep lacerations, possible broken ribs, severe blood loss. He needed immediate help, or he would die within the hour. She should leave him. A wolf this size, this powerful, was dangerous even wounded. If he woke and saw her as a threat, he could kill her before she could defend herself. But she'd never turned away from a dying creature in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. Her mother had taught her that healing was sacred, that it transcended pack politics and personal safety. "You're either going to kill me, or I'm going to save your life," Maeve muttered, grabbing the wolf's front legs. "Let's hope it's the second one." Chapter 2. Blood in the Snow. Dragging the massive white wolf through the snow nearly killed Maeve before she'd gone 10 paces. He must have weighed 3 times what she did, all muscle and bone and bloodied fur. Her boots slipped on ice-covered roots, and twice she fell completely, landing hard on her knees in the frozen undergrowth. "You couldn't have collapsed closer to my cabin, could you?" she gasped, hauling on his front legs again. The wolf didn't respond. He was deeply unconscious, which was probably the only reason she was still alive. A wolf this size wouldn't tolerate being handled by a stranger under normal circumstances. The storm was getting worse. Snow fell so thick now that Maeve could barely see 5 feet ahead. Her wet cloak felt like it weighed as much as the wolf, dragging at her shoulders and tangling around her legs. Her fingers had gone numb inside her thin gloves. She focused on moving forward. 1 step, then another. Pull, rest, pull again. The cabin couldn't be far now. She'd walked this path 1,000 times. When she finally saw the dark shape of her home through the swirling snow, relief nearly made her weep. She dragged the wolf the final distance to her door, then faced a new problem. How was she supposed to get him inside? The doorway was narrow, built for humans, not massive shifter wolves. Maeve ended up having to push from behind while guiding his head and shoulders through first, then working his hindquarters around the frame. By the time she got him fully inside, she was soaked in a mixture of his blood and her own sweat. The wolf lay motionless on her floor, taking up nearly half the cabin's available space. Blood pooled beneath him, seeping between the floorboards. Maeve bolted the door and immediately set to building up the fire. She would need hot water, lots of it, and light to see what she was working with. While water heated in her largest pot, she gathered supplies: clean cloth for bandages, her sewing kit with the curved needle her mother had used for closing wounds, dried yarrow to stop bleeding, comfrey root paste for the wounds themselves, and her bottle of strong spirits for cleaning both her tools and the deepest cuts. The wolf's breathing was getting more labored. Maeve knelt beside him and began examining his injuries properly. What she found made her stomach turn. Deep slashes covered his sides and back, some down to the muscle. His right front leg was badly torn, possibly the bone fractured beneath. Puncture wounds dotted his neck and shoulders where teeth had found purchase. One ear was nearly shredded. He'd been fighting for his life, and it showed. "Who were you?" Maeve whispered, beginning to clean the blood away from the worst wounds. "What did you do to make so many enemies?" The water came to a boil. She added yarrow to it and let it steep while she cut away matted fur from around the deepest lacerations. The wolf didn't stir, even when she had to cut close to sensitive areas. That worried her more than the wounds themselves. He should have been showing some response to pain. She worked through the night in a rhythm her mother had taught her. Clean, assess, close what could be closed, pack with healing herbs what couldn't. The curved needle flashed in the firelight as she stitched wound after wound, her fingers growing sticky with blood despite how often she cleaned them. The worst gash ran from his left shoulder down across his ribs. It gaped open, revealing muscle and the white glint of bone beneath. Maeve had to pause before starting on it, steeling herself. If she made a mistake here, if she didn't close it properly, infection would set in, and all her other work would be meaningless. "Don't you die on me," she told the unconscious wolf. "I didn't drag you all the way here just to have you die on my floor." She started stitching. Her mother had always said to make the stitches close but not too tight, to leave room for swelling. Maeve's hands remembered the lesson, even as her mind grew foggy with exhaustion. Stitch, knot, cut. Stitch, knot, cut. The gash slowly closed under her careful work. Dawn was breaking by the time she finished the last bandage. Every wound was cleaned, stitched or packed, and wrapped in clean cloth. The wolf's breathing seemed slightly stronger, though he still hadn't regained consciousness. Maeve sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd done. The white wolf was now a patchwork of bandages and healing paste, barely recognizable under all the wrapping. But he was breathing steadily, and the bleeding had stopped. She'd done all she could with conventional healing methods, but it wouldn't be sufficient. She could see that already. Some of the wounds were too deep, the damage too severe. He needed more than herbs and stitches. He needed her gift. Maeve's hand went to her shoulder again, that unconscious gesture of memory and pain. Using her healing gift always came with a price. Every injury she took from another, every illness she drew out, left its mark on her. Not physically, perhaps, but she felt it. A draining of something essential, a piece of her life force given away. Her mother had died using her gift too freely. Near the end, trying to heal others in the village, even as her own body failed. Maeve had sworn she wouldn't make the same mistake. She would use her gift only in the most desperate circumstances, only when there was no other choice. She looked at the wolf's labored breathing, at the way his body shuddered with each inhale. Without her gift, he probably wouldn't survive the day. "Moon, take me for a fool," she muttered. Maeve placed both hands on the wolf's chest, feeling the rapid flutter of his heartbeat beneath her palms. She closed her eyes and reached for that well of power inside her, the gift her mother had passed down through bloodlines older than memory. Healing energy flowed out of her and into the wolf. She felt his injuries as if they were her own, the deep ache of broken ribs, the burning pain of torn muscle, the sharp agony of punctured lung tissue. All of it flooded into her awareness, and she began the careful work of knitting it back together. She focused on the most critical injuries first, the punctured lung that was filling with fluid, the broken ribs threatening to pierce vital organs. Her energy wrapped around the damaged tissue and encouraged it to heal faster, bones to set properly, tears to close. The pain was extraordinary. Maeve had forgotten how much it hurt to use her gift this way. Every injury she healed sent echoes of suffering through her own body. She gasped, but didn't stop, didn't pull her hands away. The wolf needed this. He would die without it. She moved on to the lesser wounds, though none of them were truly minor. The torn leg muscle, the damaged tendons in his shoulder, the countless lacerations. Her energy touched each one, speeding the healing process from weeks to minutes. By the time she finished, Maeve was shaking violently. Her vision had gone dark at the edges, and she could barely hold herself upright. The cabin spun around her. She tried to pull her hands back from the wolf's chest, but her arms wouldn't obey. The last thing she remembered was the wolf's eyes opening. Brilliant amber gold, sharp with intelligence that was far too knowing for any normal wolf. They focused on her with an intensity that would have frightened her if she'd had any fear left in her. Then darkness claimed her completely. Chapter 3. The Mark of Kings. The white wolf remained in Maeve's cabin for 3 days, hovering between life and death while she poured every skill she possessed into keeping him breathing. On the first day, she changed his bandages 4 times. Each time, fresh blood soaked through the cloth faster than she would have liked. His breathing stayed shallow and rapid, his body burning with fever that made her fear infection had already set in, despite her careful cleaning of every wound. Maeve prepared poultices of comfrey and golden seal, spreading the paste thick over the worst injuries before wrapping them again in clean linen. She brewed willow bark tea and managed to get small amounts down his throat by lifting his massive head and pouring the liquid carefully past his teeth. Most of it dribbled out, but she hoped some made it to his stomach. "You're being a terrible patient," she informed him as she worked. Talking to the unconscious wolf helped fill the oppressive silence of the cabin. "The least you could do is wake up and shift so I can treat you properly. Human injuries are much easier to bandage than wolf ones." The wolf's only response was a slight twitch of one ear. Even that small movement made Maeve's heart lift with hope. Any sign of awareness was better than none. She slept in brief snatches, sitting upright with her back against the wall where she could watch him constantly. Every time his breathing changed pattern, she jerked awake, certain he was either recovering or dying. Each time he remained the same, trapped in whatever dark place his consciousness had fled to. On the second day, the fever broke. Maeve woke from one of her brief naps to find the wolf's breathing had finally slowed to something approaching normal. When she touched his flank, His skin felt warm, but no longer burning. She changed his bandages again, and was relieved to see that several of the smaller wounds had already begun to close. "There you are," she murmured, relief making her voice shake. "I was starting to think I'd lost you." She prepared a thin broth from dried meat, and got more of it down his throat this time. He swallowed reflexively, a good sign that his body's natural functions were returning. Maeve allowed herself to hope that he might actually survive. But hope was dangerous. She'd learned that lesson thoroughly over the past 2 years. So she pushed the feeling down and focused on the practical work of keeping him alive 1 hour at a time. The wolf's eyes opened for the first time late on the second day. Maeve was changing the bandage on his shoulder when she felt him tense beneath her hands. She looked up and found herself staring into eyes of brilliant amber gold. They weren't the eyes of an animal. Intelligence burned in those depths, sharp and assessing. He watched her with an intensity that made her breath catch. This was no ordinary wolf, no simple shifter. The power radiating from him even in his weakened state spoke of something far more significant. "Easy," Maeve said softly, the same tone she'd use with any frightened creature. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe here." The wolf continued to stare at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, his eyes closed again. But Maeve noticed his breathing had changed. He was no longer unconscious, just resting, conserving his strength. She finished wrapping his shoulder with hands that trembled slightly. Having those knowing eyes on her had been unsettling in a way she couldn't quite name. She'd felt exposed, as if he could see through her skin to all the broken pieces inside. On the third day, Maeve woke before dawn to find the wolf watching her. He was fully alert now, his amber eyes tracking her every movement as she built up the fire and set water to boil. The wounds were healing remarkably fast, faster than should have been possible even for a shifter. Several of the gashes she'd stitched had already knitted together enough that she could remove the threads. "You heal quickly," she commented as she worked. "That's fortunate. I was worried about infection." The wolf made a sound low in his throat. Not quite a growl, but close. Maeve glanced at his face and could have sworn he looked frustrated, as if he wanted to communicate but couldn't in his current form. "If you're strong enough to shift, you should do it," she said. "I have clothes that might fit you. They belong to a traveler who died in these woods last winter. I found them in an abandoned pack." She wasn't sure if he could understand her. Some shifters retained full human comprehension in wolf form, while others lost much of their cognitive function during the change. But she had a feeling this wolf understood every word. He didn't shift, though. Perhaps he was still too weak. The transformation took energy even when a shifter was healthy. Maeve spent the day preparing more medicines and checking her stores. The unexpected guest had depleted her supplies more than she'd anticipated. She would need to gather more herbs once the weather cleared, assuming she could find anything useful under the snow. That evening, as darkness fell and Maeve prepared a simple meal of bread and dried meat for herself, the wolf finally moved. He lifted his head, testing his strength. His legs shifted beneath him as he attempted to stand. "Careful," Maeve warned, moving toward him. "You're not ready for that yet." But the wolf ignored her. With a tremendous effort, he pushed himself to his feet. He swayed dangerously, his legs shaking with the strain. Maeve put her hands out to steady him, pressing against his shoulder. The moment her skin made contact with his fur, everything changed. Heat exploded through Maeve's body, starting from her hands and racing up her arms. The mark on her shoulder, the strange silver pattern that had appeared after she'd healed him, suddenly burned with intensity that made her cry out. The wolf made a sound too, something between a whine and a howl. Then power surged between them. Maeve felt the wolf's pain, his exhaustion, the lingering damage in his body that her healing hadn't fully addressed. But more than that, she felt something else, a connection, deep and primal, that had formed between them during those hours when she'd poured her gift into saving his life. The wolf's instincts rose up, overwhelming whatever control he maintained. He moved faster than Maeve could react, his head whipping around. She felt the sharp pressure of teeth against her left shoulder. Not breaking skin, but pressing hard. The burning intensified. The silver mark on her shoulder flared with light, visible even through her dress. Maeve would have screamed if she'd had breath, but the sensation had driven all air from her lungs. Then it was done. The wolf released her and collapsed back to the floor, breathing hard. Maeve stumbled backward until her back hit the wall, her hand flying to her shoulder. The area throbbed with heat, but when she pulled her dress aside to look, there was no bite wound. The silver mark, however, had changed. It was larger now, the pattern more intricate, and at its center, where the lines spiraled inward, was a new symbol. A crown rendered in lines so fine, they looked like silver thread beneath her skin. "What did you do?" Maeve whispered, her voice shaking. "What did you do to me?" The wolf's amber eyes met hers. In them, she saw regret, confusion, but also something that looked almost like triumph. He collapsed fully then, his brief burst of strength exhausted. Within moments, his breathing had evened out into sleep. Natural sleep this time, not unconsciousness. Maeve slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her hand still pressed to her marked shoulder. Her mind raced, trying to understand what had just happened. The mark was no accidental result of using her gift too strongly. The wolf had marked her deliberately, pressing his teeth to the exact spot where the silver pattern lay, and somehow, that action had changed the mark, added to it, made it into something more. She should be terrified, should throw the wolf out despite his weakened state, should run far from whatever bond he'd tried to forge. But Maeve found she couldn't move. Exhaustion from 3 days of constant vigilance had finally caught up with her. Her eyes closed almost against her will. The last thing she noticed before sleep claimed her was that the mark on her shoulder had stopped burning. Now it just felt warm, like a hand pressed gently against her skin. When Maeve woke, morning light was streaming through the window. She jerked upright, her neck protesting the awkward angle she'd slept at. Her eyes went immediately to where the wolf had been. The space was empty. She scrambled to her feet, searching the small cabin frantically, but he was truly gone. The door stood slightly ajar, cold air streaming in. He must have shifted during the night and left while she slept. On her table, arranged with obvious deliberation, sat a leather pouch heavy with coins. Maeve opened it with shaking fingers. Gold. More gold than most people saw in a lifetime. Payment for saving his life, she supposed. Payment for the healing that had nearly killed her. But it felt wrong somehow. Like payment for something far more significant than simple medical care. She went to the door and looked out at the snow-covered forest. Fresh wolf tracks led away from her cabin, already being filled in by new snowfall. They headed north, toward the heart of the kingdom where she'd never been. Maeve closed the door and barred it. She returned to the table and stared at the gold, at the fortune that should have thrilled her. Instead, she felt hollow. Her hand went to her shoulder again, tracing the mark through her dress. The pattern was still warm, still tingling with latent energy. Whatever the wolf had done, it was permanent. The mark would be part of her now, a reminder of the night she'd saved a stranger's life, and he'd somehow changed hers in return. She had no name for what she felt. Loss, perhaps, though that made no sense. She'd never truly had him to lose. Confusion, certainly. And underneath it all, a strange sense of anticipation, as if this wasn't an ending but a beginning. The mark pulsed once against her skin, a sensation almost like a heartbeat. Maeve shivered and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Whatever the white wolf had done, whatever this mark meant, she would have to live with it. She was used to living with scars, after all. What was one more, even if it glowed silver and carried the symbol of a crown? Chapter 4. Separation and Longing. 6 months passed like water through Maeve's fingers, each day blending into the next in a pattern of solitude and work that should have felt familiar, but somehow didn't anymore. The gold the white wolf had left bought her more than supplies. It bought her a kind of security she'd never known, the freedom to refuse work that didn't suit her, to help those who couldn't pay without worrying about her own survival. She expanded her herb garden, built a small greenhouse against the south wall of her cabin using glass panes purchased from a traveling merchant, and filled her shelves with rare medicinal plants that had once been beyond her means. The villagers noticed her improved circumstances. She told them the same lie each time someone asked. She'd found a cache of old coins buried in the forest, probably hidden by some long-dead traveler. Most accepted the story without question. Those who didn't kept their suspicions to themselves. But the gold couldn't buy what Maeve truly wanted, though it took her weeks to admit what that even was. She wanted answers. She wanted to understand the mark on her shoulder and why it had appeared. She wanted to know who the white wolf had been, and why he'd marked her before disappearing into the dawn. The mark itself remained a constant mystery. It never faded as she'd initially hoped. Instead, it seemed to settle into her skin, becoming as much a part of her as the green of her eyes, or the texture of her hair. The silver lines were visible when she looked for them, but easy to hide under clothing that covered her shoulders. What unsettled her more were the sensations that came with it. Sometimes, usually late at night when she was alone with her thoughts, the mark would grow warm, a gentle heat that felt almost like a touch, like someone's hand pressed against her shoulder in comfort or reassurance. Other times, she would feel pulses of emotion that didn't belong to her. Frustration, determination. Once, a wave of such profound weariness that she'd had to sit down until it passed. Maeve told herself she was imagining these things, that the mark was just a scar, nothing more, and the sensations were her mind playing tricks. But deep down, she knew better. Something connected her to the white wolf still, some bond that distance couldn't break. She tried to research the phenomenon in her mother's books. The oldest texts mention bonds between mates, the way paired shifters could sense each other's emotions, and sometimes even thoughts. But Maeve had been rejected. She had no mate, and the white wolf was a stranger who'd left without a word. Unless he hadn't meant to mark her. The thought occurred to Maeve one night as she lay in bed, her fingers tracing the silver pattern in the darkness. The wolf had still been fevered, still weak from his injuries. What if the marking had been an accident, his instincts taking over when he was too sick to control them? What if he'd woken that morning, realized what he'd done, and fled before she could demand explanations he couldn't give? The idea should have brought comfort. Instead, it made the hollow feeling in her chest worse. Spring came slowly to the frontier forest. Snow melted in patches, revealing the brown earth beneath. Maeve spent her days gathering the first herbs of the season, and her nights trying not to think about amber eyes that had looked at her with too much intelligence. She was collecting early mushrooms near a creek when the mark on her shoulder suddenly flared hot. Maeve gasped, nearly dropping her basket. The heat was intense but not painful, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. And beneath the heat, she felt something else. Danger. Fear not for himself, but for others. Battle rage held barely in check. "What's happening to you?" she whispered to the absent wolf, her hand pressed to her shoulder. The sensation faded after a few minutes, leaving Maeve shaken. She abandoned her mushroom gathering and hurried back to her cabin, needing the security of walls and a locked door, even though she knew they wouldn't protect her from whatever was happening through the mark. That night, she dreamed of white fur stained with blood, of snarling wolves and flashing steel, of a golden crown that felt more like a burden than an honor. She woke gasping, her nightdress soaked with sweat, the mark on her shoulder throbbing. The dreams continued for 3 nights. Each time, Maeve saw fragments of battles, of council rooms where men argued in voices she couldn't quite hear, of maps spread across tables showing territories she didn't recognize, and always at the center of it all, the sense of the white wolf's presence, his determination, his isolation despite being surrounded by others. On the 4th night, Maeve didn't dream. Instead, she lay awake and finally admitted the truth she'd been avoiding. The white wolf hadn't been ordinary. The power she'd felt in him, the way other shifters would probably have cowered in his presence, the sheer size of him, all of it pointed to one conclusion. He'd been an alpha, possibly one of significant rank and power, and he'd marked her, accidentally or not, creating a bond that should only exist between mates. The implications terrified her. If anyone discovered she carried an alpha's mark, questions would arise that she couldn't answer. Why would a powerful alpha mark a rejected omega living alone on the frontier? What claim did he have on her? What obligations did the mark create? Maeve began wearing high-necked dresses exclusively, even as the weather warmed. She couldn't risk anyone seeing the silver pattern, especially not the crown symbol at its center. That felt particularly damning, though she didn't know enough about pack politics to understand why. Summer arrived, bringing with it the heat that made working in her greenhouse uncomfortable, but necessary. Maeve's reputation as a healer continued to grow. People came from farther away now, seeking her help for ailments other healers couldn't cure. She helped when she could, always careful never to use her gift where others might see. That power was too dangerous, too revealing. One afternoon, a merchant traveling through stopped at her cabin. He was an older man with kind eyes and a pack full of goods from the capital city. After Maeve sold him several jars of her salve for joint pain, he lingered, clearly wanting to talk. "You hear much news out here?" he asked. Maeve shook her head. "Very little. The frontier isn't known for gossip." Well, you might be interested to know there's been trouble in the capital. Civil war, they're calling it. 3 packs tried to overthrow the Alpha King. Been going on for months now." Maeve's blood went cold. Her hand moved unconsciously to her shoulder. "The Alpha King?" "Aye. Rain, his name is. Young for a king, but they say he's the most powerful Alpha born in a century. The rebels thought they could take him down, but from what I hear, he's crushing them. Methodically, brutally. He's not a wolf to cross. Rain, the white wolf, had a name now, and he was fighting a war that explained the battle dreams, the sensations of danger and fury that pulsed through the mark. Is he?" Maeve managed to keep her voice steady. "Winning, I mean? Seems to be. Though the cost has been high. They say he drives himself without mercy, barely sleeps, takes every risk personally, rather than sending his warriors to do the dangerous work. Lost a lot of good wolves putting down the rebellion." The merchant shook his head. "But that's the way of kings, I suppose. The crown sits heavy on young shoulders." After the merchant left, Maeve sat at her table and stared at nothing. Rain. The Alpha King. She'd saved the most powerful shifter in the realm without knowing it, and he'd marked her in his fevered state before disappearing to fight a war. No wonder he hadn't returned. No wonder the mark sometimes pulsed with exhaustion and determination. He was fighting for his throne, for his kingdom. A rejected Omega healer on the frontier would be the least of his concerns. The knowledge should have brought relief. It explained everything, made sense of the mystery. But instead, Maeve felt that hollow ache in her chest deepen, because now she knew. The white wolf, Rain, was so far above her in status and power that they might as well have existed in different worlds. Whatever bond the mark represented, it could never be acknowledged. An Alpha King would need a mate of high birth and political value, not a frontier healer living in isolation. The mark pulsed warm against her skin as if in disagreement, but Maeve ignored it. She'd learned long ago not to hope for things beyond her reach. Autumn arrived, painting the forest in shades of gold and red. Maeve prepared for winter, stocking her cabin with supplies and drying herbs for the cold months ahead. The mark had become such a constant part of her that she barely noticed it anymore, except during those moments when it flared with emotions that weren't hers. She wondered sometimes if Rain felt her through the mark as well. Did he sense her loneliness during the long nights? Her quiet satisfaction when she healed someone successfully? Her occasional flashes of remembered pain when something triggered memories of her rejection? Probably not. The bond seemed one-sided, flowing from him to her, but not the reverse. Or perhaps an Alpha King had more important things to focus on than the emotions of an unknown Omega. 6 months after the White Wolf had left, Maeve stood in her cabin and looked at the gold coins she'd carefully saved. More than half still remained. She could live comfortably for years on what he'd given her, but the coins felt like a severance payment, a way to close the books on a debt and move on. She picked up one of the gold pieces and turned it over in her hands. On one side was stamped the royal crest, a crown above a crescent moon, the same crown symbol that marked her shoulder. "Who are you really?" she asked the empty cabin. "And what did you mean to do to me?" No answer came. There never was one. Maeve replaced the coin and went about her evening routine, trying not to think about amber eyes and the warmth of a mark that connected her to someone she would never see again. But that night, as she lay in bed, the mark pulsed with something new, not danger or exhaustion or battle fury. Something gentler. Something that felt almost like longing. Maeve placed her hand over the mark and closed her eyes. Somewhere far away, an Alpha King was fighting for his throne. And somehow, through whatever magic bound them, he was thinking of her. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it was the first thing in 6 months that made her feel less alone. Chapter 5. The Festival of Reckoning. Maeve had no intention of attending the Harvest Moon Festival in Millbrook. She avoided crowds and celebrations as a general rule, places where questions might be asked and lies would need to be told. But Petra, the baker's wife who'd become something close to a friend over the past year, had begged her to come. "You can't hide in that cabin forever," Petra had said during Maeve's last supply run to the village. "The festival has merchants from all over the region. Rare herbs you won't find anywhere else. Besides, you need the coin. Winter's coming and your remedies sell well at festivals." The argument about rare herbs had been what finally swayed her. Maeve's supplies of several key plants were running low, and winter would make gathering impossible. If she could purchase what she needed at the festival, she'd be set for the cold months ahead. So she found herself on the road to Millbrook on a crisp autumn morning, wearing the blue dress Petra had lent her. It was finer than anything Maeve owned, made of wool dyed a deep blue that reminded her of twilight. The sleeves were long and covered her shoulders completely, hiding the mark that had become such a constant part of her existence. Her hair was braided simply and pinned at the nape of her neck. She carried her basket of remedies, jars of salve and packets of dried herbs that she hoped to sell. The coins would help offset the cost of the supplies she planned to purchase. Millbrook was transformed for the festival. Colorful banners hung from every building, and the central square had been cleared for merchant stalls and entertainers. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. Musicians played lively tunes on fiddles and drums, and children ran between the stalls laughing and shrieking. Maeve felt overwhelmed immediately. She'd grown too accustomed to silence and solitude. The noise and press of bodies made her want to flee back to her cabin. But she forced herself to find an empty space near the edge of the market and set up her modest display. The morning passed in a blur of transactions. Her remedies sold well, as Petra had predicted. People recognized quality when they saw it, even if they didn't know the healer behind the medicines. Maeve kept her head down and her interactions brief, taking coins and offering thanks without encouraging conversation. By midday, she'd sold more than half her stock and had accumulated a pleasant weight of copper and silver in her belt pouch. She was beginning to think the trip had been worthwhile when she heard a voice that made her blood run cold. Well, is that little Maeve I see?" She looked up slowly, her stomach sinking. Osric stood before her stall, dressed in fine clothes that spoke of wealth and status. His hair was shorter than she remembered, cut in the style favored by successful alphas. He looked prosperous and smug, every inch the respectable pack leader. Beside him stood a woman Maeve didn't recognize. She was beautiful in an obvious way, with long red hair that caught the sunlight and eyes of pale blue. Her dress was elaborate, embroidered with thread that might have been real gold. Jewelry glinted at her throat and wrists. This had to be Osric's new mate, the one he'd chosen after rejecting Maeve. "Osric," Maeve said quietly, hoping he would take the hint and move on. "I hope you're well." "Oh, I'm very well indeed." Osric's smile was sharp. "Allow me to introduce Elowen, my intended. We're to be formally mated next month. Quite the celebration planned." Elowen looked Maeve up and down with barely concealed disdain. "This is the one you mentioned? How quaint." Maeve felt her face heating but kept her expression neutral. "Congratulations on your upcoming mating. If you'll excuse me, I have customers waiting." She gestured vaguely to the empty space around her stall, but Osric didn't move. Instead, he leaned against the edge of her table, making himself comfortable. His eyes roamed over her worn basket and half-empty jars with obvious amusement. "Selling herbs now, are you? My, how the mighty have fallen. Though I suppose you were never very mighty to begin with." He laughed at his own joke. Elowen tittered beside him. "I make an honest living," Maeve said, her voice tight. "There's no shame in that." Of course not. Osric picked up one of her jars, examining it with exaggerated interest. "Though I must admit, I'm surprised to see you here. I'd heard you were living alone in the wilderness like some kind of hermit. Couldn't find another pack to take you in?" The words were designed to wound, and they succeeded. Maeve felt the old shame rising, the memory of her rejection still sharp, despite 2 years of distance. She wanted to tell him that she'd chosen isolation, that she preferred her solitude to the cruelty of pack politics, but her throat had closed up, words trapped behind a wall of remembered humiliation. "Honestly, darling, must you torment the poor thing?" Elowen's voice dripped with false sympathy. "It's not her fault she was born defective. You're right, love. I'm being cruel. but Osric's smile suggested he was enjoying himself immensely. He raised his voice, drawing the attention of passers-by. "Tell me, Maeve, still mateless? Still searching for an alpha who'll overlook your inadequacies?" Several people had stopped to watch now, sensing drama. Maeve felt their eyes on her, judging, pitying. This was her nightmare made real, public humiliation all over again. "My personal life is none of your concern," she managed to say, though her voice shook. "Oh, but it is." Osric was enjoying himself now, playing to the growing crowd. "You see, Elowen was worried she'd offended you somehow. I had to assure her that you understood why I rejected you, that you knew it was for the best. An alpha of my standing couldn't possibly mate with an omega whose scent spoke of weakness. It would have been a disaster. You made your feelings quite clear 2 years ago," Maeve said. She was gripping the edge of her table so hard her knuckles had gone white. "There's no need to revisit them now, but that's where you're wrong. I think there's every need." Osric straightened up, addressing the crowd as much as Maeve. "You see, I've heard rumors. People saying I was too harsh with you, that I should have given you a chance. I want everyone here to understand that I made the right choice. Look at you, living alone, selling herbs like a peddler, still unmated after all this time. You're exactly what I sensed you were. Broken. Unable to attract any alpha of worth." The crowd murmured. Some faces showed sympathy for Maeve, but others nodded in agreement with Osric. Pack hierarchy was sacred among shifters. An alpha's judgment was rarely questioned, especially regarding mate selection. Maeve's shoulder had begun to burn. The mark, usually so quiet during the day, was heating rapidly beneath her dress. She pressed her hand to it instinctively, trying to soothe the sudden pain. "What's wrong? Are you ill?" Elowen's concern was transparently false. "Perhaps you should sit down. You look quite faint." "I'm fine," Maeve gritted out, but the burning was intensifying. It felt like fire spreading across her shoulder blade, down her arm, up her neck. What was happening? "She's probably overwhelmed by seeing you again, darling," Elowen said to Osric. "The poor thing still carries a torch for you, I'd wager." "How pathetic," Osric agreed. He leaned close to Maeve, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper that only she could hear. "You should have taken my offer to be a mistress when you had the chance. At least then you'd have some purpose. Now you're just a cautionary tale. A reminder of what happens to defective omegas who think they deserve more than they're worth." The burn on Maeve's shoulder flared into agony. She gasped, biting back a cry of pain. Tears sprang to her eyes unbidden, and she hated herself for showing weakness in front of Osric and his mate and all these strangers. And then everything changed. Every shifter in the marketplace felt it simultaneously. A presence, massive and overwhelming, approaching at impossible speed. The kind of power that made instincts scream in warning, that triggered the ancient submissive responses coded into every wolf's DNA. The festival noise died instantly. Musicians stopped mid-note. Merchants froze behind their stalls. Even the children stopped their games, sensing something momentous was happening. Maeve felt it through the mark as much as through her shifter senses. He was coming. Rain was coming, drawn by her distress through whatever bond connected them. And he was furious. The crowd began to part, people backing away without knowing why. A path cleared through the center of the marketplace. And then, bursting from the tree line at the edge of town, came the white wolf. He was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Larger than any wolf had right to be, moving with supernatural speed that blurred his form. His amber eyes were fixed on Maeve with such intensity that she couldn't look away. The wolf skidded to a stop 10 feet from her stall, sending up a spray of dirt. His sides heaved with exertion. Blood flecked his muzzle, suggesting he'd fought his way through something or someone to get here. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The white wolf commanded the space absolutely, his presence pinning everyone in place through sheer force of dominance. Then he shifted. The transformation was fluid and quick, fur melting into skin, shape changing from beast to man in the space of a heartbeat. And there stood Rain, the Alpha King, in the flesh. He was exactly as Maeve remembered from her dreams, the fragments she'd glimpsed through their connection. Tall and powerfully built, with golden hair that fell past his shoulders, and a beard that framed a face too handsome to be real. His eyes were still that stunning amber, and they were fixed on her with an expression of such raw concern that it stole her breath. He wore only leather trousers, his chest bare and marked with fresh scratches that were healing even as she watched. He looked like he'd run through half the kingdom without stopping, like nothing in the world could have kept him from reaching her. "Maeve," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion she couldn't name. The marketplace erupted in whispers. "That's the Alpha King. What's he doing here? Moon Goddess, he's magnificent. Why is he looking at that healer woman?" But Rain ignored them all. He crossed the distance to Maeve in 3 long strides, his eyes never leaving her face. "Are you all right? I felt your pain through the bond. I felt your distress. What happened?" Maeve couldn't speak. Her mind was still trying to process the impossibility of his presence. The Alpha King had come for her, had felt her through the mark, and crossed whatever distance separated them to reach her. Osric, who'd gone pale as death the moment the white wolf appeared, found his voice. "Your Majesty, this is merely a misunderstanding." Rain's head turned slowly, his attention focusing on Osric with the precision of a predator selecting prey. "You. Who are you?" "Osric of Silver Creek Pack, Your Majesty." Osric bowed so low he was nearly bent double. "I meant no offense. I was simply speaking with an old acquaintance." "An old acquaintance." Rain's voice had gone deadly quiet. He looked back at Maeve, at the tears still wet on her cheeks, at the way she was clutching her shoulder, where the mark burned. "Is that what he was doing?" "Speaking with you." Maeve nodded mutely. "And these tears? This pain? They're simply from conversation?" She wanted to lie, to diffuse the situation before it escalated, but she'd never been good at lying. And something in Rain's eyes demanded truth. "He was reminding me of my rejection," she whispered, "telling me that I'm broken, worthless. He didn't know about—" She gestured helplessly between them. Rain's expression didn't change, but the temperature of the marketplace seemed to drop 10 degrees. When he spoke again, his voice carried command that made every shifter present instinctively lower their eyes. "This man rejected you as his mate? 2 years ago," Maeve confirmed. Rain turned back to Osric, who looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. "You rejected her. Why?" "Her scent, Your Majesty. It was wrong. Weak. It spoke of infertility, of defectiveness. Any alpha would have sensed the same." Osric was babbling now, desperate. "I swear I meant no disrespect to you. I didn't know she was connected to royalty. How could I have known?" "You couldn't have," Rain agreed. His hand reached out, hovering near Maeve's shoulder. "May I?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. Gently, carefully, Rain pulled the fabric of her dress aside, exposing the silver mark on her shoulder, the mark that now bore a crown at its center, glowing faintly in the afternoon sunlight. The crowd gasped collectively. Even those who didn't understand pack politics recognized royal markings when they saw them. "This," Rain said, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent marketplace, "is a claiming mark. My claiming mark, placed on my true mate 6 months ago. The woman you just called broken and worthless is destined to be your queen." Chapter 6. Truth and Claiming. The silence that followed Rain's declaration was absolute. Maeve could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. The Alpha King's mate. His queen. The words seemed impossible, too large for her to comprehend. "Your Majesty." Osric's voice cracked. He was trembling now, all his earlier confidence shattered. "Please, I didn't know." How could I have known? She was just a frontier healer living alone. There were no signs that she was marked by royalty. Rain's amber eyes never left the mark on Maeve's shoulder. His fingers traced the silver pattern with reverence, following the lines that spiraled inward to the crown symbol. His touch was gentle, but Maeve felt power in it, the same overwhelming force she'd sensed when he was dying in her cabin. "You didn't know because I marked her while fevered and barely conscious," Rain said, his voice carrying to the entire crowd. "I was near death, saved only by her compassion and skill. My wolf recognized what my human mind couldn't process in that state. She was mine, destined by the moon goddess herself, so my wolf acted on instinct and marked her before I could stop it." He turned to face Maeve fully, and she saw regret in his eyes alongside the fierce possessiveness. I need to explain. I need to tell you what happened after I left your cabin. You don't owe me explanations, Maeve whispered, though part of her desperately wanted to hear them. I owe you everything. Rain's hand moved to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I woke that morning and realized what my wolf had done. I'd marked you without your consent, without even speaking to you properly. I was horrified at myself, but I also knew I couldn't stay. Because of the war, Maeve said, remembering what the merchant had told her months ago. Yes. The attack that nearly killed me, the one you saved me from, was part of a larger conspiracy. 3 packs were in open rebellion, trying to overthrow the crown. I had to return immediately to lead the defense of the kingdom. Every hour I delayed meant more of my wolves dying. Rain's voice roughened with emotion. I wanted to take you with me, to bring you to the capital where you'd be safe and honored, but bringing you into a war zone, into a palace full of traitors and assassins, would have been a death sentence. So I left you gold and ran like a coward, planning to end the war quickly and come back for you. But the war didn't end quickly, Maeve said softly. No. It took 6 months of brutal fighting to crush the rebellion completely. 6 months where I couldn't leave the capital, couldn't come back for you, couldn't even send messages. His expression darkened. I tried. Moon Goddess knows I tried. I sent 5 different messengers with letters explaining everything, asking you to wait for me. All 5 were intercepted and killed by rebel spies monitoring the roads. The crowd was utterly silent, hanging on every word. This was history unfolding before them, the Alpha King revealing secrets that would be told and retold for generations. I had to keep you secret, Rain continued. The rebels would have used you against me if they'd discovered my mate lived alone and unprotected on the frontier. So I sent guards to watch over you from a distance, keeping you safe without revealing themselves. Every day I couldn't come for you was torture. The bond pulled at me constantly, showing me fragments of your life, your loneliness, your quiet strength, your kindness to those who couldn't pay you. Maeve's breath caught. You felt all that? Through the mark? Every emotion. Every moment of pain or joy. It flows one direction more strongly from me to you. But I still sensed you. Still knew when you were troubled or afraid. His eyes burned into hers. And today, an hour ago, I felt such sudden anguish from you that I thought you were dying. I was in a council meeting 100 miles from here. I shifted mid-sentence and ran, using the old royal magic that lets Alpha Kings traverse distances in impossible time. Nothing could have kept me from you. Maeve felt dizzy. The mark, the connection she'd felt all these months, had been real. He'd known about her, thought about her, tried to reach her. She hadn't been forgotten. But why? She asked, her voice breaking. Why would you want me? I'm nobody. A rejected Omega with no family, no status. Osric was right about my scent. Other alphas have sensed the same weakness in me. I can't give you what a king needs from his mate. Rain's expression turned fierce. Osric is a fool who wouldn't recognize true power if it bit him. He raised his voice again, addressing the crowd. Do you want to know why her scent seemed wrong to lesser alphas? Because she's not meant for lesser alphas. She's a selective Omega, born to mate only with the strongest wolf in the kingdom. Her scent